to everyone, and especially Madam Ambassador. Thank you for being here. As you know, the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act of 2000 launched a bold, comprehensive public-private sector strategy that included sheltering, political asylum, and other protections for the victims, long jail sentences and asset confiscation for the traffickers, a myriad of preventive initiatives, and tough sanctions for governments that failed to meet minimum standards prescribed by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It was bipartisan, and I know David Abronowitz is here, who worked very hard on that, as did others on both sides of the aisle. It was 3 years in the making. It was not passed overnight. It was given a great deal of look by everyone, especially the administration, which initially opposed most of it, but in the end was signed into law by President Clinton. The bill also created the Trafficking in Persons Report and tier rankings, and I, in all candor, while I like much of what's in the product, and I've read through most of it now, and I think it was a very effective effort on country after country. I mean, the number of countries that are on Tier 1 is a record, as you point out in your testimony, Madam Ambassador, and I think that's a good thing. A number of countries, probably a record again, have actually updated or passed laws that are more responsive, particularly to victims. But there were concerns, and I raised these because to me, it's all about the victims and how do we prevent victimization and how do we assist those who are currently or in the future going to be victims. And I remain concerned that both last year's TIP report and the current one gave passing grades to several nations with horrific records of government complicity in human trafficking. Falsifying a country's human rights record, particularly when it comes to branding what tier it ought to be, not only undermines the credibility of the report, but was especially dehumanizing to the victims who suffer rape, cruelty, and horrifying exploitation. There are several instances, and I'll get to those in a moment, where you read the report and it inevitably leads to this ought to be a Tier 3 country, and then it doesn't merit that for some reason. The passing grades for failing more than a dozen governments was exposed by a series of investigative reports last year by Reuters, which found that professionals at the State Department's TIP office made one set of recommendations only to be overruled at a higher level for political reasons. Today's hearing will look closely at the newly released Trafficking in Persons report, which assesses and ranks 188 countries each year on their records of prosecuting traffickers, protecting victims, and preventing human trafficking. Some of the rankings comport with the records of certain countries. Burma and Uzbekistan, for example, are designated Tier 3, as they should be. But other nations, including trading partners Malaysia and China, are given a free pass despite their horrific records of government complicity in human trafficking. Cuba, a dictatorship highly favored by this administration, is again falsely touted with a passing grade. China was allowed to keep its Tier 2 watch list rankings despite the fact that the reason for their upgrade 2 years ago was found to be a fraud. Alexandra Harney, Jason Zepp, and Matt Spetelnik of Reuters authored an expose on China's politicized ranking, finding that, and I quote them, 2 years after China announced it was ending the re-education through labor system, extrajudicial networks of detention facilities featuring torture and forced labor thrive in its place. I would put note parenthetically, as chairman of the China Commission, we just held another, it's my 60th hearing on human rights issues in China, and we focus exclusively on the systematic use of torture in China. It is growing, not diminishing, in its usage, exploiting so many people, including people who are forced into labor. China has deceived the United States, had deceived it in 2014, and when it became apparent last year, we let them keep their ill-gotten upgrade in 2015 and again in 2016. I would hope that that would be revisited again, and at any time you deem it necessary to make a change, obviously you do have that capability to do so. Malaysia, whose ranking was upgraded to the Tier 2 watch list last year on the flimsiest of justifications and fears, it would be disqualified from the TPP, was allowed to maintain its Tier 2 watch list ranking despite the fact that Malaysia faltered in its anti-trafficking progress over the last year. In fact, Malaysia, a country with 4 million migrant workers, prosecuted fewer trafficking cases and convicted only 7 traffickers last year. That's less than when it was a Tier 3 country. Meanwhile, women from Burma, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Philippines, and Nepal are trafficked to China for forced marriages. And I read with special interest what you write in the report about the Philippines and their efforts, maybe even Herculean efforts, to try to mitigate trafficking there. And that's recognized in their significant upgrading. North Korean laborers worked under conditions described by experts as forced or slave labor to earn income for the North Korean government. Prisoners of conscience and other prisoners continue to be held in administrative detention facilities where there are numerous credible reports of prisoners being trafficked for the purpose of organ harvesting. And on that score, just a couple of weeks ago, I chaired a hearing on organ harvesting, and it was brutal to hear first-person reports and human rights reports by NGOs about what is actually occurring there. The State Department must get the TIP report right, or we will lose the foundational tool created to help the more than 20 million, maybe more, victims of trafficking enslaved around the world. A tier ranking is about protecting vulnerable lives, lives destroyed or saved by the on-the-ground impact of a government's inaction or its inaction. The easiest cases for Tier 3 ranking should be those where the government itself is profiting from human trafficking, such as in Cuba, where thousands of Cuban medical professionals labor in dangerous countries not of their choosing, their passports taken, their movements restricted, their families and licenses threatened, and their salaries heavily garnished by the Cuban government. It is not a coincidence that Cuban law does not recognize labor trafficking. Maria Ware-Lu testified at our hearing in March that, and I quote her, "Trafficking is a huge operation run by the government through numerous state enterprises with accomplices, participants, sponsors, and promoters all over the world. Cuba is also a known destination, a country for child sex tourists, and Cuba reports no convictions for child sex tourism. Yet Cuba, although it had been previously year after year ranked Tier 3, is ranked Tier 2 watch list again this year. We've seen many countries take a Tier 3 ranking seriously and make real systemic changes that improve their tier rankings, but more importantly, protected trafficking victims. Countries such as South Korea and Israel come to mind. When the Bush administration branded South Korea and Israel Tier 3 based on their records, both countries, and I met with ambassadors several times from those countries, who wanted to get off as quickly as possible, and I would tell them, and I wasn't the only one, the tip office said it ad nauseum to them, it's all about performance. It's all about what you do, not what you say. Both countries enacted and implemented policies to combat human trafficking and were given earned upgrades for their verifiable actions. But other countries attempt to end-run the accountability system with endless, empty promises of action or mostly meaningless gestures of compliance. China sat on Tier 2 watch list for 8 years, each year promising the State Department they would implement their anti-trafficking plan. Each year, the State Department took the bait until Congress put a limit on the Tier 2 watch list, 2 years only, unless the President gives the country a waiver. Well, China has once again promised to implement a plan, and the President just gave them a waiver to stay on the watch list a 3rd year. Tier rankings are about real prosecutions that are verifiable. We know they happened. It's not just a list that is tendered by someone in the government to our embassy or TIP official. Real prevention and real protection for real people who are suffering as slaves. The TIP report was meant to speak for the trafficking victims waiting, hoping, and praying for relief. While the 2016 TIP report speaks for many of them, too many are still unheard. I'd like to yield to Karen Bass, our ranking member, for any opening comments she might have. I yield to Mr. Cicilline.